In this video, I'm going to show you how I make a simple and elegant sheath for an integral knife. The first thing we do in a sheath build is cut out our leather pieces. I'm using some pre-dyed black cow leather. I love the pre-dyed leather because the dye goes all the way through it and it's nice and even. It's about 1/16 of an inch thick, or maybe a little bit over. The front of the sheath will get covered in shark skin. Once the leather's been cut out, I take it over to the broadbed grinder with a 120 grit belt and clean up the edges of the leather. It's hard to perfectly follow the lines on my leather when I cut it out with a razor knife, so the grinder really allows me to clean up and fine tune the edges. I've been using my old grinder for so many years that I totally forgot my brand new broadbed grinder has an amazing feature, and it tilts over horizontal and makes it so I don't have to sit there sideways while I'm grinding on parts, and I can actually look right down at what I'm doing if I just remember to flip the grinder over. Once I flipped the grinder over to horizontal, it made cleaning up those edges much easier. This will be a pouch style sheath, and I want the sheath to be able to bend a little easier in the center, so I use a skive to shave away thin strips of leather just to thin it out a little bit and make it easier to bend later on. I really like using the skiving tool. It's a super simple tool, but it's really satisfying to peel off layers of the sheath. It's similar to a potato peeler, only instead of it having kind of a dull blade, it has an actual razor blade on the edge. The skive can leave the leather a little bit rough and uneven, so I take it back over to the grinder and just clean it up a little bit with that 120 grit belt. The next step is to use contact cement on the shark skin and the cowhide in order to stick the two pieces together permanently. You apply a good layer of contact cement on each piece and then let it dry for about 10 minutes, or accelerate the process by using a hairdryer, and then stick the two pieces together, and then, as the name contact cement implies, use a hammer and lightly tap all over on the leather to really seat the glue and make it stick really well. I can then use a razor knife to trim off the excess shark skin. Right now is the time to round over and smooth the edges around the belt loop and the top of the sheath. If I wait and do it later, it'll be much more difficult once the sheath has been folded into a pouch. So I'm using a quartering tool to round the corners. We want the fibers of the leather to lay down so they're not rough and coarse. So the gum and the burnishing with the antler makes it lay down nice and flat and becomes super smooth and even shiny to a certain degree. Now I need to focus on folding the belt loop and sewing it to the body of the sheath. I mark out the area I want to use contact cement on, and then I use a razor knife to roughen up the surface, and that'll help the contact cement adhere a little bit better to the smooth leather. I use a hairdryer to accelerate the contact cement's drying process a little bit. Instead of waiting for about 10 minutes, we can use the hairdryer after about 30 seconds and be ready to stick the two pieces together. Get the belt loop all lined up right where it goes, and then add some contact. I want the belt loop to be sewed in place, so I cut a small groove where I want the stitching to be, and then I use a stitch marker to mark out where each stitch will go. I like to use my Dremel tool hooked up to a drill press attachment and drill out all the holes for the stitching. Now that we see where the holes come out on the other side of the leather, I can use the small grooving tool to connect all the holes with a small groove. That'll allow the thread to sit below the surface of the leather, so when we put the knife in and out of the sheath, it won't be scraping on thread sticking up. I want to add my maker's mark and MS stamp to the belt loop, so I wet the leather down, let it sit for a few minutes, and stamp both of them in. now begin working on the welt of the sheath. So we need to lay out where the welt will go inside the sheath, and I just kind of roughly mark it out with a pin, and then I can cut out a piece of leather that will become the welt. If you don't have a welt, as you slide your knife in and out of the sheath, it could cut the stitches open and your sheath would be ruined. But with a welt, as you slide your knife in and out, if the edge touches anything, it should just rub against the welt, and the leather is very tough and wouldn't get cut into for a very, very long time. Once I'm done shaping the welt, we can use contact cement to cement it in place, but only on one side of the sheath for now. Before I permanently finish contact cementing the sheath together, I want to use office clamps to simulate the sheath being completely closed up. And then I can put the knife in and out of the sheath and kind of get a feel for how it fits. Because I can make minor adjustments at this point by adding or removing a little bit of the welt to make it thicker or thinner in places if I want. Everything's looking good, so we can close this sheath up. I'm gonna coat everything in contact cement, use the hairdryer, and close up this pouch. Before we stitch the sheath together, I wanna clean up all the edges. Some of the layers of leather don't match up perfectly with the other layers, so we can quickly grind them all nice and even with a 120 grit belt on the broad bed grinder. Cut a small groove where I want the stitching to go, so the stitches lay below the surface of the leather. Mark it out with the stitch marker and start drilling away. Once all the holes are drilled in, we can cut the small groove on the back side of the sheath so that the thread sits below the surface of the leather once again. I'm doing a saddle stitch on this sheath using some very strong wax covered thread. For the saddle stitch, I like to use 2 needles and go about 2 holes at a time before I pull everything nice and tight, and then continue on another 2 holes. Something I like to do after the stitching is finished is go over it with the stitch marker. The stitch marker makes the threads lay down nice and flat, and it makes everything even out and look really good. One of my best secrets to making a sheath look a lot better is to round the edges of the sheath. They'll make the sheath look much thinner and more streamlined. So once again, we're back at the broad bed grinder with a 120 grit belt, and I put a really nice dome to the edge of the sheath. Trust me, this will definitely make your sheaths look a lot thinner and more streamlined. And just as before, to make all the fibers of the leather lay down smooth on the edges, we use the gum trag and the deer antler to burnish the fibers of the leather down. You can keep doing this until the leather is super smooth and actually gets kind of shiny. I'll let the sheath dry overnight and then we can put the finish coat on it. I like to use some Wyosheen leather finish and an airbrush to apply it. And here is our finished sheath. We've got a nice, clean, elegant look with shark skin covering the entire outside of the sheath. And for the inside of the sheath, we have the nice, smooth, black cowhide, so the knife will have a nice place to live. I'm very happy with how this sheath came out. I will see you in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this content, then please consider giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the algorithm, and that really helps us out.